Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started while people are coming in. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's my pleasure to moderate the very first webinar of the Education Knowledge Broker Network. The network launched in March of this year to create a professional community for those that work to promote stronger relationships between research and practice, whether that's through literally building relationships between researchers and practitioners, or advocating for evidence use in policy and practice, translating or developing research-informed products, creating more democratic structures to engage with evidence in educational decision-making, or any number of other activities. Because there's so many of us in this field that are doing the work, it's important for us to have a space to connect with each other, learn from each other, and grow as a profession. So if you're not familiar with the network or interested in staying in touch about these activities, we're going to put a couple links in the chat to our website and to a newsletter sign up. So on to today's program. So the role of knowledge brokers and the concept of a knowledge broker has deep roots in other sectors, such as public health, social work, and some other areas. For example, in the health sector, there are literally roles in organizations where people are called knowledge brokers, and they have the task of facilitating and sharing different kinds of knowledge. In the United Kingdom, for example, there's an annual forum that brings practitioners of knowledge brokering together. But in the context of US education, the idea of knowledge brokers is still new. And even if we know people have been doing this work forever, they may not identify with this role or have had an opportunity to connect with others to do this work. So our goal as a network in this first set of programs is to demystify knowledge brokering, which we are doing today. So I have the privilege of facilitating this conversation, and I'd like to introduce our panelists. Katie Philp is a community-based educator and researcher. She works with youth-serving organizations to both apply and inform research and informal learning. Matthew Courtney is a former elementary music educator. Thank you for the wave. I should have told Katie to wave too. Turned knowledge broker consultant. He works directly with school leaders and educators to help them access and synthesize research for decision making. Max Altman is a former math teacher and current education researcher at the Southern Education Foundation. And in various roles, he's worked to support teachers and school district leaders and regional and national level positions to build towards educational improvement. Lenay Dunn is joining us from West Ed today. She's a former teacher and current researcher and fosters knowledge exchange and evidence use to help states, districts, and partners improve systems, opportunities, and outcomes. And not with us, I want to acknowledge, is Antwan Perry. He, as in true broker format, got pulled away in a last-minute activity that he really regrets not being able to be here. But he's an experienced higher education professional, who now teaches and works in higher education policy and has contributed both at K-12 and higher education levels across a variety of roles in his career. So if he's able to join us today, he will. And until then, we will get started with this amazing panel. My name is Liz Farley-Ripple, and I'm at the University of Delaware. I co-direct the Center for Research Use in Education, and I direct something called the Partnership for Public Education, where I, too, am a knowledge broker. So this work and this conversation is really dear to my heart. Just before we get started, a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be shared on our network website. You can keep your cameras on or off, whatever you're comfortable with, but please put your name, organization, and pronouns into your name so we know who's here. We ask that you remain muted until we have open discussion and Q&A. And if you're not muted, our hosts may mute you just to keep the conversation going and eliminate distractions. We mean no disrespect. We also want to encourage you to use the chat freely. We want you to talk amongst yourselves. We want you to ask questions of the participants. We want to share your ideas and experiences. Feel free to like comments or add emojis to comments. So that kind of helps this make connections to our own practices and our own learning. We're also going to do our best to monitor the chat and support learning, and we're going to sort of accumulate questions for the Q&A at the end. Okay, so let's jump in and get started. So earlier, I shared that knowledge brokers often work between research and policy practice, or other communities in the education system. And they facilitate exchange of knowledge and ideas across those boundaries. Could you each tell us a little bit more about that work? So, what communities do you work to bridge, and how do you support knowledge exchange? I'm going to ask Matt to kick us off.
Well, greetings, everyone. How do I work in knowledge brokering? I work in a space with classroom educators, building leaders, and system level leaders, helping them to make connections between the research and the decisions that they have to make. We know that these leaders often struggle with access and time to do that work. And so I step in to help bridge that gap so they can make thoughtful, evidence-based decisions for their institutions.
Thank you. How about you guys popcorn to each other? I'll pick on the next person. How about Katie?
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. So I work primarily in community-based settings with nonprofits or grassroots organizations who are working with youth and families. And so for me, knowledge brokering will often look like helping these organizations connect to the research. This can be helpful either to improve their practice, or a lot of times they're using research adjacent principles to do their work, and it supports their efforts to obtain funding or increase their visibility for the work that they're doing. Other times it can kind of go in the opposite direction, where I'm helping to inform researchers about the work that's happening on the ground and the needs and challenges that the organizations are dealing with, which I can share a little bit about how knowledge brokering can work both bidirectionally a little later. Lenay, I'll go to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I think similarly, I'm working across a lot of different communities and different levels. I think a primary kind of level I work at is at the state education agency level, connecting to local education agencies and districts for research and evidence use. And I just wanted to piggyback on that reciprocal idea that Katie was talking about, because I think that's something that's really crucial to the kind of work that I do, that it's not, research to practice necessarily. It's research and practice informing research. And so I really work collaboratively with partners at all levels of the system to think about how we can learn from what's happening on the ground and how research and evidence can inform decisions that happen at the ground. So Max, I'll pass it over to you.
I am the only one left. Thank you. The Southern Education Foundation works with a number of broad partnerships that include educators and community members in a variety of roles. I definitely also want to highlight from my seat in our research work that as much as we are asking what can research contribute to the conversation, we're also asking what is needed that research can help to learn. And of course, we know that the people who know those things are the practitioners who are doing the work every day. So I really work to move between various levels within the same conversation, but that involve a lot of different perspectives, and to really think through what is it that's needed, what do we know, what do we want to know, and how do we put that together in ways that are useful and can be iterated to support practitioners, to support those who support practitioners, and to support other roles within the advocacy, community development aspects of the spectrum.
So one of the things I appreciate about this panel is that you're all working in sort of different ways with different parts of the educational ecosystem. And that's something I think that's really important as folks on this call, folks who might be listening to this webinar later, think about as they come to identify with this idea of being a knowledge broker. Which leads me to this question: how did you find out or figure out that you were a knowledge broker? One of the challenges in the field is that we don't use this language to describe a particular position or a job. So how did you come to identify as a knowledge broker? Matthew, maybe I can pick on you again. I won't always pick on you.
You always pick on me anyway, Liz. Yeah, so for me, this one kind of always makes me laugh when I think back on it. I've been in this sort of research use space for over a decade, working with schools and districts. And I've written about knowledge brokers in a very professional and academic setting. I've published papers about knowledge brokering, but I never applied the term to myself until someone else did. And then I thought, oh, I guess that is the work that I do.
Max, how about you?
Sure. Well, I started out as a teacher, and as many of you know, as a teacher, you need content knowledge and you need teaching knowledge, but you also need knowledge of specifically how to teach the content. PCK, it's often called. And I realized as a teacher that I was seeing kind of professional development for teachers in a similar way. That there's this idea that it's not just about knowing best practices. It's about finding a process to think through questions and then answer them in ways that are, we might say, systematic or just that make sense. And I realized that as much as I loved teaching within my classroom, I could see the broader impact that I had in groups and conversations with my fellow teachers. So I'd started a kind of a faculty advisory committee, participated in some professional learning communities, and gradually realized that as much as I love teaching, I really saw a lot of potential in that thing that as yet I had not named and did not have a name for until this knowledge brokers network began. So from that, through some grad school and some projects that brought me closer and closer to teacher collaboration and to professional learning and to things like that, I really began to realize that there was a process here that it was very important to understand better. And that in many cases, having seen from my own classroom and then while working with other teachers, a lot of professional development, a lot of support for various different people within the spectrum just did not seem to consider those characteristics super well, just in the same way that a lot of college STEM teaching might not necessarily take into account things we know at the high school level, right? And really getting some opportunity to think through that has been great. I'll pass it off to Katie.
Thanks, Max. Well, similar to others, I really didn't use the term knowledge broker for myself until I connected with the Education Knowledge Brokers Network. But having that language allowed me to recognize what I was doing. I mentioned earlier sort of about the translation from practice to research. As I got deeper into my own research work, I recognized that there was a disconnect in the literature between what I was reading about and what I was seeing and hearing from my colleagues, specifically in after-school settings. The literature was really framing the worth and value of after school as an academic component, and trying to, measure what we describe and define is typically what we measure. And so often we were measuring in terms of academic outputs, and particularly for youth of color and marginalized youth. And on the flip side of that, what I was hearing from practitioners is that these are spaces that are critical for youth development in ways that transcend pure academics. And so at that point, I started publishing some policy and position papers to argue for a reframing of how we define and measure after-school programs. And so I think that's just sort of an example of how we play this really important role in connecting these two often disparate branches of our systems that in ways that can now inform research practice, research endeavors to really serve the students and the practitioners in ways that benefit them.
So what I hear across many of your responses is that learning to or becoming a knowledge broker, identifying a knowledge broker comes out of some of the work that you're doing, just realizing, oh, I have been doing this boundary spanning work, or this boundary spanning work just becoming really important in the context in which you're working. And so that makes me think about one of the other aspects I wanted to make sure we cover in this demystifying knowledge broker conversation, which is what knowledge brokers actually do. And we can tell from some of your comments so far that there's a wide range of activities and work going on. So I'm actually going to pull this question a little bit from the knowledge broker literature. And actually, we're going to drop a couple of literature reviews, open access ones, of course, in our knowledge brokering work. We want to make sure people can access things into the chats in case folks want to learn a little bit more about what has been done academically on knowledge brokering. So in these frameworks, in these literature reviews, some of the common activities that knowledge brokers engage in are around capacity building for producing or using research, or facilitating engagement or knowledge exchange, creating tailored knowledge products, advocacy work. So I was wondering if you guys could tell us a little bit more about, do those match with your work? Could you tell us what those activities might look like in your work? And also, I would like to invite the audience, I think we already prompted that in the chat, to reflect on these categories as well and maybe share what this looks like in your practice. Lenay, can I ask you to jump in since we sort of didn't catch you in that last category?
Sure. So I think one of the ways this shows up in my work is on knowledge products. So I work, one of the main hats I wear is the Regional Educational Laboratory West, and RELs, or Regional Educational Laboratories, really do a lot of work to try to bring research and evidence into the hands of people who will use it to improve policy and practice. And so I'll give an example from some of the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides. So these kind of have these evidence-based recommendations that are meant primarily for practitioners to help them be able to use this evidence in their work. So what we've done is tried to chunk that into kind of more bite-sized pieces for different audiences, like families and caregivers, teachers, school leaders, through some different knowledge products. So one of the What Works Clearinghouse practice guides is on English learners and bringing, content area knowledge and English language development into middle school and elementary school for English learners. And so we developed like family and caregiver activities that took these evidence-based recommendations and said, as a family member, what are some activities you could do? So we have these little kind of one-page front and back that take these evidence-based strategies, describe what they are, but show you can do this in a cooking lesson at home, that you can work together on language development. And this is what it looks like, and step by step for a family or a caregiver to pick it up and use it. We also developed things like tools for teachers to self-reflect on their practice and how well it reflects those evidence-based recommendations and where they might need some professional learning and support to better kind of develop that. And for school leaders, we have things like observation protocols that kind of show what would this look like in a classroom. If teachers and students are embodying these recommendations, what would you see? So trying to take those concepts and that evidence-based actions and really customize it to different audiences to fit the needs. So I think that's some of the kind. We do a lot of different kinds of kind of knowledge products, but I just wanted to share that suite of things because I think it shows how we can take one set and then really customize it to different audiences.
That's great. That's really interesting to think about the different ways we can, I don't know, be effective in working across those boundaries, communicating ideas in ways that are useful and relevant to those audiences. Thank you so much for that. Matthew, I know that you've done a lot of capacity building work. That's part of how you introduce yourself. Could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the capacity work that we do is some of the most important parts of knowledge brokering, because if the recipients of that knowledge don't know how to interpret it, don't know how to use it in a meaningful way, then it's just words on a page. So I work very closely one-on-one with school and system level leaders to help them learn how to really break down the elements of a research study, how to pull out the most important information, how to decide if a research study is appropriate for their school and their setting and their decision-making processes. Helping them to identify biases in studies that may obviously then bias their decisions down the road. Those are really important skills. And then bringing that beyond the leadership spectrum down into the classroom. And one of my favorite activities is when I get to work with groups of teachers to help them really understand how they can use research to inform the problems of practice that they face every day. I love to train on things like action research techniques, where Educators in the classroom can identify a problem of practice and can go all in, use the research, design a solution, test a solution, and resolve that problem in their classroom in real time. I'm also working in professional learning community settings, thinking about how can we build sustainable systems in our schools where those PLCs are reading research, they're discussing it, and they're having those higher level, more elevated professional conversations about their professional practice and how they're going to continue to improve teaching and learning in their schools.
Thanks. Max, I want to turn to you. When you sort of shared a bit about your background and work, you shared about working across different levels on an issue or on a topic. So it sounds like your work entails a lot of that facilitating engagement and knowledge exchange. Could you share a little bit more about what that looks like?
Absolutely. If there's one thing I know from the work that I do, it's that no one knows more about the answer to a question than the people who are on the ground doing the work. No one knows more about what's needed in classrooms than teachers. No one knows more about what's needed in communities than members of those communities, particularly members whose voices may sometimes be hardest to surface. Within each role, there are people who already have a strong set of experiences that are incredibly valuable, and to me far more valuable than what I can learn externally. Right? If I enter a situation and I think that I'm bringing the most important knowledge from my research role, I am sure to be wrong. Instead, uh, we build a lot of conversations, right? And my role is often to facilitate those conversations in ways that do not necessarily even require me to be an expert. We have an early childhood partnership at the Southern Education Foundation, and I am not an early childhood educator. So it's very easy for me to remember in those conversations not to accidentally think that I know what's going on, which I wouldn't anyway, right? The people who know what's going on are the people who are doing this work. In that, that's an instance where it's very easy for me to remember that because I legitimately don't know what's going on in early childhood education in any meaningful way whatsoever. But what I do know is that the role of constructing conversations in which people can surface their knowledge, can share it across different perspectives and organizations, and then can build a body of shared knowledge that incorporates what we all know and moves us forward better than we could each do individually is really, really powerful. And that's something that a lot of people simply don't have time or space for in the roles that we have. I constantly tell people we need more people whose work centers on constructing useful conversations and coalitions and what have you to create opportunities to facilitate exchange of knowledge and building a shared body of knowledge.
I really appreciate that. I think that's an incredibly important core competency or skill. Um, and activity, right? It kind of it's kind of all of those things. And it strikes me as I look across all of your comments and the kinds of work you're doing, and I know you only had a moment to share um, a little bit about your work because I know you're all doing all of this work. Um, and it strikes me that being a knowledge broker is sort of demanding of a lot of knowledge and skills that maybe aren't obviously ones we can name, that you learn, or it's not a course in college, right? And like, here's all the information you need to know to be a knowledge broker. So I was wondering if you might share a little bit about, and you've hinted this throughout, but maybe a little more explicitly, where you developed skills to become a knowledge broker, and maybe if you're willing to share sort of what the most important skill or piece of knowledge um, you would say there is in being a knowledge broker. Katie, can I pick on you to start us off?
Of course. Well, I would say, my path to where I am today has been very nonlinear, and I haven't always worked directly in the education system, even though I've worked education adjacent for many years. I've also worked in public health and in other sectors. And so I think that has allowed me to recognize the importance of helping disparate groups communicate. And so oftentimes, even across fields, we're talking about very similar concepts and ideas, but we're using different terminology. We're relying on different research backgrounds and so on. So we're bringing different views and lenses to the work. But oftentimes there's a really similar common ground that we can find. A lot of times what that means is renaming and redefining these things for shared language so that we can communicate effectively across our teams. And, you know, I think that's where knowledge brokers can play a really important role, is recognizing when that's happening before communication breakdowns occur. And so kind of level setting those expectations early on, that communication standards have to be upheld and kind of paid attention to throughout the team process, has really helped me build those skills and bring those into the work that I do today.
Great. Lenay, do you have anything to add and want to share about how you developed your skills?
Sure. I think they're, you know, obviously always in development, right? But I think that the 3 skills that I think about are listening, connecting, and curating. Those are the 3 skills I've really leaned on. And I think I sort of, I think connecting comes kind of naturally to me. That's something, connecting people, connecting ideas, has been something when I was a teacher I did, you know, throughout my career. So I think I developed the skills as a knowledge broker without consciously being aware that I was developing the skills as a knowledge broker, because I was first and foremost trying to listen to those that we're trying to serve and support. And, you know, to Max's point, no one knows better what they need than the person who needs something. So really trying to ground it in what do people want and need, and then connecting them to people or research or opportunities that will help meet that need. And then I think the curation part comes in, like, there's so much research and evidence out there on lots of different topics. Of course, there are places where there's a dearth of research or evidence. That's a different discussion. But where there's saturation, some of it is really helping cull through that and say what actually meets the need that's been identified by the partner. What are the things that would inform the decisions that they're trying to make or the use that they're trying to make? So I think that curation point has been something that can show up in a lot of different ways. You know, physical curation of resources is one way that can look, but it's also just really being mindful about developing those skills in yourself, and then building the capacity of the partners you're working with to do that themselves, right? And I think that's where that exchange piece comes as well, is partners on the ground, so practitioners, teachers, others that are doing the work with students primarily. You know, there's so much also that they're learning, and helping them curate from their own learning and reflect on that, connect it to others, and listen to those who might need it. So that kind of brings that reciprocal piece back in. So I think those are the kind of the 3 things I think a lot about.
Hey, Liz, I'm monitoring the chat, and I thought there's a question from Charlie that is sort of digs a little deeper into the conversation we're having right now. And so let me just pose it. And Charlie, if you want to get on and ask it in beyond what I read, and then we'll see where this takes us. It is also a question of, are there other sectors that are more fully developed than education in the knowledge brokering arena that we can learn lessons from? But Charlie's question is, can we get more specific about exactly what a knowledge broker is? Technical definition, does it vary across industries? And some of the defining recent research in the field. Anybody want to take a stab at that to build upon what you've already been saying? If you dare.
Well, it's quite a big question, and I'm not going to tackle it, but I will say some of the defining research in the field, I think both of the reviews that we dropped into the chat do a really nice job of looking in the Neil article across sectors, and the Rykoff-Smith article within education. And you can see that there's a number of challenges to defining it. So I'm punting, and I'm also buying my panelists time to respond. Is that there isn't a single definition that's used, for example, in the literature, and we use a lot of different language. We might say boundary spanners, we might say intermediaries, and we might say knowledge brokers. And so I'm not going to define it, but I think all of those things are relevant to the conversation. All of those terms and all those ideas are relevant to the kind of work we're talking about under this larger umbrella of knowledge brokers. So I'm going to let the panelists weigh in. Anyone want to take a stab?
I'll take a stab. I think, well, first, I agree with Liz that there really isn't a well-formed technical definition, because it does look different based on your setting, based on your organization, based on your role and expertise. Different knowledge brokers are going to approach the work from different lenses and perspectives. To me, that's what makes the work so exciting. And as we do the work of this network, as we build a network of knowledge brokers who can collaborate together, being able to understand how that looks in different parts of the industry is just a real untapped opportunity for us all to learn from each other and kind of professionalize this space a little bit more. As more and more people start to identify as knowledge brokers, we'll have a better idea of what it looks like in different settings and how we can support one another as we grow the field.
I'll hop in and add that I think in many ways, at least the way I see it, knowledge brokering is really about a mindset, that you can have people in the same role, but with different mindsets about what that role looks like and what that process is. I think teachers are a great example, right? I've worked with teachers who are very best practice focused, who do a lot of that go between work, whether for themselves or along with their colleagues. And I've also worked for teachers who think a bit more rigidly about delivery of information. I think the former category is a set of people that, if they don't define themselves as knowledge brokers, are absolutely ready to, to hear a little bit about that framing and to incorporate that into the way they think. Similarly, I think people who are in roles that seem to lend themselves to knowledge brokering can also have needlessly rigid mindsets about what they do that does not really make them knowledge brokers or effective knowledge brokers, because they're not thinking about what are those double arrow connections from practice to research back to practice, what are the spaces in between, and how do we build that together. It's a lot about, I think, about building things collaboratively, and very little about having a role that you can do alone. It's almost defined, I think in some ways by the collaborative nature of the role and the collaborative action. And something that we know about mindsets from great research is that they're not born into people, right? Mindsets are skills. Mindsets are taught the same way other skills are taught. And by sort of building a framework of knowledge around knowledge brokering and giving it a name, I think part of the hope, that we have is that we will give this more of the kind of learning treatment that it deserves, rather than, as currently so many people who do this work, who are making it up as they go, who are figuring it out on their own, making their best guesses, finding things that work and don't work. That's a great way to go about making some decisions and drawing some conclusions. But it really, it doesn't give all of the opportunity that we have to pool our collective knowledge about how this works.
And I just think it's a good thing that we don't have a rigid definition of knowledge brokering in the education space, because from my perspective, I want anyone to see themselves as potentially a knowledge broker, potentially a connector. So Charlie, I think you were putting in the chat saying, is being a knowledge broker synonymous with being a professional learning facilitator? So I think it could be, right? I think that's one way it could show up in schools and districts, is if you're fine as a professional learning facilitator, you're taking good, research-based practices, evidence-based practices, and you're supporting teachers and learning how to use those practices, that's absolutely knowledge brokering. And so, having a broad definition allows more people to see themselves in it, because I think that there are ways it could show up that we haven't even thought of yet, right? And so if we don't have a rigid definition, I think we're going to learn as a network from each other of how it could show up.
And I think I love this question because I think it's really capturing why we're here today. First of all, to kind of share some of the breadth of what knowledge brokering can look like across individuals and organizations, but also because we're in the process of building this field together, and that's why we've invited others to come join us on this journey. And we really do want input from others, and as Lenay said, there could be work going on that we haven't even conceptualized yet, and so that's why we want to hear from you in terms of what you're doing in your work and practice to understand what knowledge brokering looks like across our system. So I think this is one of those questions that's really the heart of what we're talking about today and what we'll be talking about over the course of the next several months in our programming. So please stay tuned, and we also would love to hear your feedback and insights into this work.
And maybe that's a great segue to the poll that I forgot to initiate earlier, which is we'd love to hear from the folks in the audience about how they identify or how they think about knowledge brokering. So our amazing colleague, Debbie Miklos, who keeps the world running for me, has just posted a poll. If you have a second to fill it out, and this is an opportunity to reflect. I'm just going to give another couple seconds for the last few folks to participate if they would like to. I'm going to end it.
Let's just welcome all of our newest knowledge brokers to the club if you're just realizing that today you are a knowledge broker.
Yeah, it's so exciting to see, look, a lot of us here identify as a knowledge broker, which is great. I would love in the chat if folks would be like, how did you figure out you're a knowledge broker? Or if we can open up in a moment or two for some Q&A to share some of those stories. I love that some of us have never thought about ourselves as knowledge brokers. I had an experience a lot like some of our panelists and apparently some of our audience too, when I'm a researcher by training, right? So that's where I started. And I became a practicing knowledge broker, but I didn't know that. I was just like, oh, I really care about this connection between research and practice. And I want my research to matter, and I'm going to better understand this. And so I started studying brokers. I'm like, oh, these are the things brokers do. And someone was like, that's what you do, right? Like Matthew kind of had the same story, right? And you're like, oh, and so it's actually very nice to have a word or a term that I can apply to that aspect of myself, of my identity as a scholar, that I really care about this work and I want to do it. And it's really great to find more people that are now using that term to describe themselves, because now we can find each other. So that's exciting to me. So I'm going to ask our audience to go ahead and share some Q&As if you want to raise your hand and chime in, or if you'd like to ask a chat in the question. Chat in the question. I said that backwards. Is it Friday? Just checking. Ask a question in the chat. That would be great. So Charlie, I love you. Thank you for your questions. He asks, what research do you think needs to be done in this space in the next 2 years? I'm going to interpret that, Charlie, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, as to better understand the role and work of knowledge brokers. Is that what you're thinking? Okay, so um, I have thoughts because that's my jam, but I would like to hear from our panel.
So I'll start. I think that for me, anytime I'm interested in research that helps to elucidate something, that to me means I want to talk to the people who are doing it and understand what their takeaways and experiences are. Uh, I think there is a lot of work around structures for conversations, and some of it focuses on particular areas like professional development. But I think less that kind of understands what people who have good experience broadly doing knowledge brokering work identify as key processes, key characteristics, and what people who have participated in those conversations see as important needs. I think, there's kind of data analysis research that sort of talks about outcomes, but I think really the research that's needed here is research that builds the narrative around what does this work look like, what does it feel like, what are big challenges, and what are great opportunities within it.
Some of the research work I'm exploring in this area comes into how we overcome the barriers to research adoption and the uptick of research use within classrooms, especially. There's some physical structural barriers that stand in between teachers and classroom use, but there's also some philosophical barriers. There's some sort of practical and some emotional barriers as well, that are already documented, but there aren't a lot of interventions and strategies for how we can actually break through those barriers. So that's some work that I'm looking for in the next couple of years, really thinking about how do we take classroom teachers who are data hesitant, who are research hesitant, and how do we move them to be really embracers of research in a meaningful way.
This is, I don't want to say that this is the key research question, but an area that I think is interesting is sort of around these natural inclinations to broker. Lenay had mentioned earlier her interest in connecting people and being a connector. And there's some interesting research that shows that some people are more likely to play that role than others based on personal history or just personalities even. And so I think that we could learn a lot from understanding who is just drawn to knowledge brokering. And that way, again, you can kind of understand what are those key skills that are being developed in people who are just naturally practicing these playing these roles. And we can kind of build our understanding of how that translates across to potential trainings or professional development for knowledge brokers in the future.
I just was thinking about, Katie, something similar, how we have, there's effective practices of professional learning, for example, like the 7 aspects of effective professional learning from Linda Darling-Hammond and colleagues. Wouldn't it be cool to have eventually, like, here are, the evidence-based strategies that knowledge brokers in many different ways that could show up, many different people who could do this work, but here are some of the effective strategies that knowledge brokers use, and that we could have evidence that those strategies actually help inform and improve outcomes, right? Because I think that's a big jump to make, but I would love to see us get there sometime so that we could think about how we do it and how can we get better at it to actually make improvements.
I want to pick up and not to cut that conversation short because I agree, and I have so many thoughts about directions for research, including how knowledge brokers develop all the skills, things we've talked about. But I really want to hone in on Erin's question in the chat, which is fabulous. The question is there a risk that the growth of the field and conversations like this may risk the fluidity of the definition that we're celebrating right now? In other words, will attempts to characterize and formalize the field limit what knowledge brokering is and can be and who can do it? I think that's a really, really important question. Years ago, I thought about this in the context of thinking about teacher leadership, because teachers have been leading from the classroom forever, and there was a big recognition of this, and then we all of a sudden we're going to credential it, and we're going to have formal programs for it, and then it changes the nature of teacher leadership. I'm not saying it did, it could, but all of these are potential outcomes of formalizing. So I will say, as someone who was involved in the founding of the network that is hosting this event, and the colleagues that got involved here, we want to just have a space to think about these things and talk about these things, and imagine what it might look like to have professional community, because I think the opposite of that is that everyone's doing their own thing, reinventing the wheel. They're isolated. They may be marginalized in their organization if their organization doesn't have or value this work, right? So having this space, I think is really important, and this idea for this network and the conversations we're having came from the ground. It wasn't any of our individual ideas. It came from those ideas. So I think that's a great perspective for us to keep in mind, and to how do we keep it inclusive? And I'll be honest, we wrestled a lot about who should be on this panel, and how do we represent different aspects of the work, and who should be involved, and how can we pull people in? And since the network is early, we're still growing in this way, and excited to expand. So Erin, keep us in line with that question. And we'd love to keep in touch with you about that work. Does anyone on the panel want to add to that?
I'll just add that I think, I think many people have a really strong tendency to want to rigidly define the work that they do. I think we talk a lot about silos in education, and it really often leads to people who are already doing work that they've made specific enough that some of the intersections aren't obvious, making the work they do even more specific. That's a definite risk for sure. But I think that by thinking in ways that are inclusive and that try to broaden, not limit the definition of what a knowledge broker is. And really, if we're thinking in terms of something that defines, knowledge brokers, maybe that thing could be more focused around goals for outcomes than for the actual work that's being done. That knowledge brokers are people who work in a wide range of contexts for particular purposes. And those purposes, I think, really guide more than the specificity of the role, what exactly it is that people do. I also think that there is, within my own role at the Southern Education Foundation, if I define the work that I do specifically based on my title, I think it would limit what I do. When I think of the work that I do, I think of it as a bunch of stuff. I do a bunch of stuff, a whole lot of stuff, and the stuff is all purposed in the case of my organization around improving outcomes and increasing opportunity for Black students and other students of color, students from low-income families in the South. That the more we can have conversations where we can add in and broaden people's perspectives on what kind of roles there are. We just heard from a journalist, right? We heard from people who are doing professional development. Just in this small group, there are a whole lot of different roles. I think that we can counter that tendency to want to over-define what a role is by just broadening people's set of perspectives on what the roles even are.
Anyone want to add? Or if not, there's a really nicely provocative question in the chat that I'm going to ask maybe Matthew to start with, because I imagine he has thoughts.
I do have thoughts on this one, Liz. So the question in the chat is, how do we think AI technologies are going to impact knowledge brokering in the future? Well, I think AI technologies are impacting knowledge brokering today, and the work that we do and how we do it. AI technologies are tools, and I always say a tool is only as good as the person who's using it. You can use a hammer to build a house, Matthew cannot use a hammer to build a house. Like that is not going to be a good house, right? And so I think the same way about AI technologies. Being able to use AI to quickly find research, to quickly sift through, maybe you're looking for research with only certain kinds of outcomes or certain kind of populations. AI tools can be really powerful tools for that kind of work. I'm really hesitant still to think about AI in terms of doing the synthesis work for us, because that's really the professional work of knowledge brokering, thinking about how we pull this together and make sense of a varied data set or a varied set of articles. And then also, John, you beat me right to it, the relationship piece here, being able to really tap into your empathy and understand the space and the situation of the person who you're helping. That's something AI is never going to be able to do. So I encourage AI use. I have resources that I use all the time and share with other people on AI use. But again, a tool only as good as the user.
I love that, Matthew. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead,
Lenay.
Katie.
I'll just quickly add, I think in some ways AI, it makes the role of knowledge brokers even more important than ever, because while you can compile evidence and quickly find it, you still need a human to interpret it and recognize the quality of it and understand how to apply it and use it. And thus far, I believe it still takes humans to do that work. And so, while AI is a really useful tool and we should encourage continued exploration of it, I don't think we're yet at the stage where knowledge brokers are irrelevant.
Yeah, I was just going to speak about that curation component. And that's exactly what I think, Kitty, you're talking about, is like being able to sift through that and be able to make the matches of what's relevant and how could this be used, and listening to how a partner would use it and working with them on its application. Like that curation, the connection, that's a human function for now.
Yeah, I really appreciate those comments. I think that when I talk about knowledge brokering and we talk about it in this fellowship program, like we talk about the work as both relational, which John mentioned, Matthew echoed, but also contextual, right? And there's understanding the people you're working with, understanding the challenges, that empathy piece, understanding the local context. What are the resources available? What are what are the communities that you're serving, and what are their priorities, right? Like that is a really hard thing to replace. And I think that's really at the core of our work, whether you're working sort of at the federal level or you're working in community-based work like Katie, or with youth, right? That it's important to have that local contextual knowledge. And I will also add that AI is currently building on knowledge and data and things that exist and have existed. And we know that what has existed for a long time has, in biases, has institutional and structural racism built into it, and lots of other challenges that we don't want to replicate. And so I think as we consider and curate and broker and facilitate, right, being able to be forward thinking in redressing some of those challenges and inequalities, that is not, again, not something yet that AI, I think, is ready to do, at least not in the knowledge brokering sort of space. Well, we are rapidly reaching our time here. Is there any final questions in the chat that we want to bring to the panel?
I would just say, Liz, to kind of wrap things up, is where will the Knowledge Brokers Network be in 3 to 5 years? What's your vision?
Well, that's a great question, and it's not my vision, so we'll pose that to the panel here. I'm not sure that we were really explicit early on in my introductions that the members of this panel are also members of the steering committee of the Education Knowledge Broker Network. And so our goal in demystifying knowledge brokering and connecting with all of you is to carve out a larger community. So maybe as a final remark, each member of the panel could share one aspect of their vision for the network moving forward. And I'm going to pick on Lenay.
One aspect, I think, that we're defined by who we're including, not who we're excluding.
I love that. How about Katie?
I will just say, would love to be able to meet others who say, hi, I'm a knowledge broker.
Max?
I want to see it really democratized, a coalition that is not about roles and is not about hierarchy, but is really about collaboration and a broad range of perspectives that are given equal weight, equal value in building something together that's better than what we'd each be doing alone.
Matthew?
I would love to see the network grow to be a powerful, unified voice in the policy space, really advocating for evidence-based education for all children.
Wonderful. Well, I want to give a huge round of applause and thanks to our panelists here, Max, Matthew, Katie, and Lenay. I also want to acknowledge our esteemed staff, Debbie Miklos and Jim Kolmus, who have helped facilitate this event. And then with my last moment here, I just want to share our information about some upcoming events that we'll be having. So in continuing to try to demystify knowledge brokering, we're going to have a knowledge cafe. We're going to drop into the chat a little bit more about what we mean by a knowledge cafe. That's going to be hosted towards the end of this month. We're also going to be having some network opportunities at the end of July, happy hour. You can also use this QR code to visit our website for more information. We also have those links dropped in the chat. So we hope that you consider joining us or staying in touch with the network. And if there's any questions you have for us or would like to get involved in any way, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you again to the panelists for sharing your stories, to our guests for asking such provocative and thoughtful questions. And we hope to see you later this month and enjoy your summer.